In this tutorial, we're going to explore features of Forest Pack Pro introduced since version 3.6 to create the modern barns image we see here. For convenience, this has been split into 5 parts. In the first part, we're going to look at trees and sunflowers, using multiple and exclude areas. In the second, we'll create the road, including the stones and flowers, and for this we'll use falloff maps and probability curves to control distribution. In the third section, we'll create the fence on the left-hand side, the bushes and the overgrowth. We use create mode, paint areas and inverted falloff maps. In the fourth section we'll create the striped lawn and some ivy. We'll be using maps to control transformations like scale and rotate, and revisiting paint areas to position the ivy. In the fifth and final section we'll be looking at optimizing materials and using forest colour to add variation. Before we begin, make sure you've downloaded the scene starter files from the ITOOSOFT website. You should find files there for V-Ray and Mental Ray. You'll also find completed versions of the scenes if you'd just like to explore them. So to get started, let's open 3D Studio Max. So once you've downloaded the files from ITOOSOFT, we're ready to go. Let's go to File, Open, and in here you should find V-Ray Start and Finish files or Mental Ray Start and Finish files, depending on the renderer that you're using. I'm going to start with V-Ray. Let's just take a few seconds to look at this scene. So far, as it stands, it's very straightforward. We have a ground plane, a road, 2 barns, one of which is in position and one of which is ready to go, and some objects over here ready to be scattered. There are also a few splines in the scene, just to make life a little bit easier as we set these forest objects up. To get started, we'll create a new forest object using this spline here as the distribution area. So let's go to Geometry, i2 Software and Forest Pro 3, and then click on the spline object. This creates a default forest object with billboards as the geometry. What we want to do is to pick up the 2 trees we've got over here as custom objects. So with the forest selected, let's go into geometry mode. We've got one geometry object there already, which is currently set to a template. We want to change it to a custom object. Click here to select an object from the scene and click on the taller of the 2 trees. It's going to bring up a warning now just to say this is a high poly mesh and that it would be wise to enable limit visibility for the camera, cloud point display, and enable only the animation at render time. This is sage advice, so we will enable those. And then we're going to click on plus to add a new item and custom item, and then pick the second tree. And if we look over here now, the forest is scattering those 2 trees. So nothing new so far. Before we go any further, let's change the distribution map so it's just slightly more dense. So to 81,800 is a figure I arrived at earlier that made me happy. And I'm going to go down to Transform and add some randomized rotation and scale just to add more variety. So for X, -10 and 10 for minimum and maximum. Same for Y. The Z is great as it is. And then if we go down to scale, we can change the maximum value to 140 just to give us a little more variation, some taller trees. Now one of the great things about the new areas is that they enable us to make a lot of changes on the fly without having to constantly redraw splines. So in this case I want to put this barn in the midst of this forest, and I don't really want to have to draw a spline around it every time I move it, so we can use an object area which can use any geometry in the scene as an exclude area. So if I just click on this here, and it's asking me to pick an object from the scene, so I'm going to pick the barn. Again, it's giving me a warning about large areas, so we can click on yes for that, that's fine. And now that's added that as an exclude area. And what you should see if I move this now is that as it goes through the trees, the trees directly beneath the barn vanish. And this is great because, as you can see, this is incredibly easy to edit. But as it stands, the trees are being excluded from underneath the barn, but immediately next to it they're so close that the branches are going through it. So what we need to do is to change the way that the trees check for the boundaries. And there are two ways of doing this. The default mode uses a single point, which is the pivot point of the tree, to check the boundary. There is another way which uses the size of the tree to check the boundary, and you'll get more accurate results. So let's just come down here on the spline trees, because this is the spline that's creating them, and where it says boundary checking, change it from point to size, and then you'll see the trees move away from the barn, because it's now using the size of the tree to calculate the boundary check. And as I move the barn now, you can see clearly that the trees are moving from around it. Now if you find that the trees are just a little bit too far away from the barn, and there is some distance here, we can change the size that it's using for this boundary checking individually for each geometry item. So if I go back into geometry, into say tree tool, you'll see there's a collision radius here which is measured in percent. As I bring this down, you'll see the trees start to creep a little closer to the barn. I want to bring them closer without them actually touching it, so let's say 40% might work pretty well. And let's do the same for the tree wide and change that to about 50. So now you see they're a little closer, but they're still not touching. You can see as I move the barn, the trees still move around it. So we want to put this in a position. This square here is the sort of front garden, if you like, for this. So we want the steps to be leading down into that area. So I'll just move this around till I'm happy. Get a little close to the road. And about there is good. Now we want to do the same thing for the road. So let's just go back to our forest object. Back to areas. And click on object area again, and then click on the road. And just like before, you can see that the road now clears a space through the forest. And as with the barn, if I move the road, you can see that the forest updates automatically in your viewports. What we want to do now is to add some trees manually in the foreground. If you look at the original render, we have a tree in front of the barn. There's one just out of view here casting a shadow, and there's a couple on the left hand side, and the idea is to sort of help to frame the views back into this barn in the background. So we just want to create those, and we can do this using the custom edit modes. So if we turn off areas here, go into tree editor, and in mode go into custom edit. Now this is going to throw up a warning, because switching to custom edit mode basically removes the automatic parameterization of these areas here, this exclude area, and it also changes the distribution settings. So these trees are then sort of fixed in place, and it gives you this warning. So you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. So click yes. And just to prove that, if I move the barn now, you can see the trees no longer update. But that's fine because we've positioned it. So in custom edit mode. So forest has a sub-object, which are the trees themselves, and in custom edit mode I can actually select each tree and move, rotate or scale it as I see fit. But I can also create new trees in this mode. So if I click on add items, I can choose which tree I want from the drop down list here, tree tall or tree wide, and I can position them just with a click. So I'm going to go tree tall, and you can see there's a tree here on the right hand side of the frame, so it may be easier to do this from the camera view that we're using. I'll just put the safe frame in, and we want one about here. Great, but it's a bit small, so let's select it and scale it a bit. Now we also want some trees down the left hand side, so again from the camera view, if you like, you can start clicking to add a few of these. And the idea is to kind of lead the eye. And in the very foreground, I want one of the wider trees, which is about here probably. And I want one about here to cast a shadow on the barn too. See how that looks. So this one's out of shot. So I'll select it, move it in a bit, go back to camera, and now I can move it around until it looks about right. There's about good. Okay. And you can add these as you see fit, but there's a sunflower field here, so we don't want to overdo the amount of trees in it. Might just add a few along here. And just lower them, just to fill in the horizon line, which actually looks a bit further over. So let's just move them back. That's where they are. So we just want to fill in that horizon line there so we can't see the kind of join. Okay, and the last place I want to put one is just behind this fence here, behind the balcony, just to kind of ease this transition down here into the rear barn. So back into perspective view. I'm going to use the tree wide again, add items, tree wide, and put one about there. That's a bit small, so let's scale it up. And move it into position. Okay, so for this scene, that's the trees done. There is, by the looks of it, a tree sticking through the building there, so let's just try and grab that and move it. Let's go out here actually. And then I might also quite like a building just in front of the porch here, just to cast a nice shadow across the inside and just for the composition really. So let's go to trees tool, add items, trees tool, and just drop one in about there. So that will do for the trees for now. Next up we'll move on to the sunflowers, which uses a very similar technique. Having created the trees, we'll now move on to the sunflowers. The sunflowers are created using two spline areas. We've got spline sunflowers here and spline sunflowers 2 just over here. And it uses a very similar approach to the trees. So again, let's create Forest Pro 3 object and click on spline sunflowers there. And let's go to modify. And in the areas, add another spline area. And click on spline sunflowers 2. Like so. So at the moment it's using a template, and we want it to add our sunflower meshes, which are proxies actually in this case, and they're tucked away just over here. So we'll go to geometry and click custom object, click on none, and the first sunflower, new object, custom object, the second sunflower, and the third. We've got 3 sunflowers in the scene. Let's just unhide the camera, because this is going to create quite a lot of geometry soon, and it'd be helpful to limit it to the camera view. So I'll just unhide the camera, go to camera view mode in forest object, click on camera none, and select this camera here that we're using to limit the views. Turn on area limit to visibility. As you can see, the distribution is quite sparse, so we need to go into distribution map, and we'll change the units to about 22,600. And also sunflowers are a little smaller than I would hope, so I'm going to go into geometry and just take the global scale up to 120%, which will have the effect of scaling everything in the scene. And then finally, to add the randomized rotation and scale, we're going to transform. We'll enable rotation and set the X to -10 and maximum to 10, Y to -10 and 10, and this time we'll set the Z to -40 and 40, since sunflowers tend to grow facing one direction. Enable scale, and the default settings are fine for this. Now at the moment the sunflowers are running up to and over the road because this is just a simple rectangle, and I haven't bothered to kind of draw it around the road. So we can do the same trick as the trees and add it as an exclude area. So let's go back to the sunflower object. And in fact, let's name it while I'm here. Forest sunflowers. Go to areas and another object area, and this time pick the road. So now you can see the sunflowers are excluded by the road and are doing a pretty good job of following the edge of it. Now there is going to be a fence on the left hand side of this, and you can just about see the spline for it here, and you can see the sunflowers on the wrong side of that fence at the moment. So what we need to do is to move them ever so slightly back from the road, and one of the ways we can do that is to scale the exclude object up a little bit, so it actually gets larger in the calculation and moves this ever so slightly back. And what I've found is it's a small scale up, about 102% works quite well, and you can see that just pushes the sunflowers back ever so slightly. And what you might find, because this is excluding over such a large area, that you'll get more accurate results by also increasing the resolution. So I might double that to 1024. Now this works by behind the scenes creating a raster map which this road is kind of projecting down on top of, so it kind of creates black and white areas that it uses to calculate the exclusion. So the resolution in this case refers to the pixel resolution of the raster map that's being created behind the scenes. You may find there's another way of doing that too, which you might prefer, which involves using falloff maps, and I'll just have a look at that as well while I'm here, because this is working quite well on the left hand side, but on the right here, and this, which is less visible from the camera actually, so it doesn't really matter, it's still encroaching on the road, and it's to do with the way that this object scales from its pivot point. So another way of doing this might be to put the scale back to 100, and you can leave the resolution as it was in fact. Coming down to falloff density and changing the edit curve so that it's basically shear. So we'll add a point here. Oops. Another one here. It should be about in the middle, but that's a rough guess. And now, by turning up the exclude, I can start to move that back from the edge, and it's working a little bit more effectively. So there's two options for doing that there. But for the sunflowers, that's it. It's that simple. So in the next one, we'll look at creating the track in the foreground of the scene. But before we do that, let's just have a look at adding the trees as an exclude area, so that we don't have sunflowers growing right up to the trunk of the tree. It actually leaves a small space underneath, as you might expect. So this is an example of the ability of Forest Pack to use another forest area as an exclude. So we can click on add a forest area as an excluding area here, click on these trees, and you see immediately what happens is that the sunflowers are cleared from the base of the trees. a little bit too far, if I'm honest. So perhaps what we can do is bring the scale back down just to bring it a little bit closer. Something like that. And that's an enormously powerful feature, because if this were a forest in generate mode and I was fiddling with the parameters of it every time the forest updates, so too would the exclude areas in the sunflower field. So it makes for very, very fast editing. And that concludes this first video tutorial. In the second, we're going to create the road running down the centre of the image, including some flowers and pebbles. In doing so, we're going to learn a little bit about custom falloff curves to control distribution, and using probability curves to control scale variations.